Good morning, welcome. As the PCPs are starting to move into, and the resources of the PCPs are moving to the regional, sub-regional public health units, and it is lovely to be able to meet with you in kind of the last sort of few days of my time at Inner East PCP. So I'm finishing up with the PCP at the end of this month. There's still some time while the Inner East will be still transitioning, but it is really lovely to have this conversation about some of the work that's been on the PCP, Inner East PCP agenda, and supporting partners with their work in social inclusion over the last 3 years. So thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And it's not to indulge just all about me, but or the PCP, but just it really is a great opportunity and to reflect on some of the work. And also, before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and I'm coming from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I'm up in the northeast suburbs of Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and the emerging leaders from the First Nations communities, and show our support for the work that they're doing, and particularly recognise that we're on land that hasn't been ceded, the implications that has had in the context of the conversation that we're having today about social inclusion, and the very significant impact, of course, on First Nation people of colonisation, and ongoing implications of that work for inclusion and other forms of oppression and engagement in our community, and the role that we can play in that. And on behalf of the group and the PCP, we express hope for reconciliation and justice. So just where we're heading to today is just really a brief reminder about the framework. I know that people have engaged with it, seen it before, and had presentations. So really this is about a practical session today, but just to remind ourselves, I think it doesn't ever hurt to go back to our sense of first principles and why we're doing the work and what we're hoping to achieve. And of course, in the work that we're doing in social inclusion and public health generally, health promotion, we're always concerned about equitable health outcomes, health and life outcomes. And as the World Health Organization identifies, if we really are concerned about that, then we must also concern ourselves with promoting social inclusion. And that being included is so vital to all the dimensions of health: material, psychosocial, political empowerment, all of these things that underpin our social well-being and equitable health. And I think it never hurts to remind ourselves of these first principles, because whenever we're having conversations with people about why we're doing the work, what we might be advocating for, why it's important to put resources towards this, then I think these values statements that align with the values of our organisations are really useful to reflect back on. And also, I don't think it hurts that the World Bank has identified that social inclusion in and of itself is important, but that also exclusion is costly, and it's important to promote social inclusion in order to build a shared prosperity for everyone. So just as a reminder about the framework that was launched in December of 2020, and the purpose of the framework, the social inclusion frameworks, was to think about what are some of the things that we need to think about in practice to apply our commitment to social inclusion. How do we bring it about in practice? What are some of the things that are really important dimensions? What does it mean for our work? And recognising that in early days of when we started doing this work, that the group of the Inner East had adopted the definition from the Australian Social Inclusion Board about that social inclusion is that people have the resources, opportunities and capabilities they need to learn, work, engage and have a voice. And all of those dimensions of social inclusion are further explored in the framework, and all the implications of those 4 key platforms, I guess, for social inclusion, and to be thinking about, in order to work towards social inclusion, these are the 4 key elements, but also recognising the importance of this part of the definition, that people have resources, opportunities and capabilities they need. So recognising therein an equity principle within the context of the framework, that people have the things they need, which is not the same for everyone, as we know. And so this is part of what this framework is trying to encourage us to think about. Where do we need to apply the equity principles? What are the things that mean that everyone has the resources, opportunities and capabilities they need, and within the context of their circumstance, and addressing that requirement to thinking about what is it about the mainstream, for want of a better word, that means that some people don't have equal opportunities, resources and capabilities, and what can we therefore do in a mainstream context to change and to modify, to think about our norms, practices and structures, systems, attitudes, beliefs, behaviours that mean and enable people to have the resources, opportunities and capabilities that they need. So that's kind of the key elements of the framework, and in applying the thinking, and I just referred to thinking about norms, practices and structures that apply at a individual, but more importantly at a community, organisational, institutional level. And this part of the framework that we're going to explore in more detail today, because from the examples that have been sent through already, it is evident that people have given quite a lot of thought to the dimensions of learn, work, engage or have a voice, and that's already what's on the agenda. And also, to a degree, to this next level of the resources, opportunities and capabilities that people need. So just as a reminder, so some of the examples are talking about opportunities to participate in educational training, importance of work, and the many dimensions of what we mean by work in this context, whether it's not only paid employment, but recognising the importance of acknowledging unpaid or voluntary work, and the work that goes in with that is involved in family and carer responsibilities. Certainly, in the examples that we're looking at further today, the importance of engaging, for people to connect with one another, to use local services, to participate in, really obviously very critical in a local government context. And so that's really useful discussion that we're thinking about that today, and also linked very closely with that because of the opportunity to influence the nature of engagement, that I can the importance of having a voice in order to be able to between those two dimensions. So just exploring a little bit more about what we mean by resources, opportunities and capabilities, and thinking therefore about what it is that we can do to address. Thinking about these in terms of the resources, opportunities and capabilities, what are some of the dimensions of those that therefore is that level down again in thinking about where might we be able to have some influence on these to make sure that we're thinking about what do people need in order to learn, work, engage or have a voice, and where can we have some influence to enable people to have these resources, opportunities and capabilities. So things such as what might be our role in transport, or looking at the social infrastructure or our community facilities, urban design. So not every entity will have the capacity to influence all of these dimensions, but just thinking about what are some of the things that we do have some capacity to influence in our roles and in our broader organisations. So thinking about, obviously, and for local government, community facilities is something where there's an opportunity to influence the nature of the community facilities. And the Burundara example that has been sent through is about very closely linked to community facilities and social infrastructure and urban design. So clearly, in thinking about that, there's a capacity to influence the nature of resources available to people, to enable people to engage, learn, work, engage, or have a voice. So certainly thinking about that, and what is it that is relevant in those circumstances to support that opportunity, that resource. With opportunities, so things like how do we create our social environment? What role do we have in creating an environment where people don't experience discrimination based on race, gender, faith, ability, sexuality, age? What is it that the role that we can play, so that we make sure that when we do provide opportunities for people to engage or have a voice, that they feel that they belong. So we create the environment where we don't set people up by creating opportunities for which they then don't feel that they belong there, they're not welcomed, their contribution is not equal. So what do we need to think about in the context of providing such opportunities? And how can we support people with their, at a systems kind of overall organisational structural level, what capacity do we have to influence and support people to develop capabilities? So that's kind of where we're heading with our thinking today. So it's keeping to digging on down and thinking about what does that mean for our planning and how we approach our work. So just moving on. So I guess just to reiterate and have a little bit of a think too about some of the other and related concepts that are identified in some of the plans, and just to recognise that, and some of the work that's been submitted and some of the things that are driving the nature, that's the frameworks that you're talking about. So for example, Manningham's got a loneliness strategy, and some of the work will be sitting around community connection, or sometimes we might be looking at addressing social exclusion as the top line, if we like, of what it is that we're calling the work, and just to identify the relationship between these key concepts and social inclusion, and how the work that we're talking about today and the approach that we're taking today and within the framework really does relate to these key concepts. But just, I suppose, to note that so if we think today, we're thinking about not only explore before what are the resources, capabilities and opportunities people have to learn, work, engage, have a voice. We're really going to be working more today about thinking about norms, practices, structures, systems, behaviours, attitudes at these levels that we have influence on, that enable resources, capabilities and opportunities to be expressed in order to be and taken up in order for people to learn, work, engage and have a voice. So already I can see with the work, and I'm not saying this isn't happening as well, but already you can see how people are thinking about this and are drilling down to here. But what I suppose the framework is helping us to think about is how do we drill that next sort of layer down and make sure that we include that sort of thinking in the work that we're doing in our planning, to make sure, I guess, we're applying kind of an equity lens and are enabling opportunities and take up equally. So just kind of in summary, our work promoting social inclusion focuses on fostering and building the institutional and social norms, practices and structures, these things here, that in turn determine whether people do have the resources, opportunities and capabilities they need to learn, work, engage, have a voice. So I guess what we've done with this framework and what we're thinking about today and applying that is the definition, understanding the definition, the importance of the definition, recognising that it isn't just about learn, work, engage and have a voice, but there's a dimension to that about resources, opportunities and capabilities. And we're saying here through this, there's a further dimension to that about making sure that our systems and structures, community institutional norms, practices and structures are key in determining whether people do have the resources, opportunity and capabilities they need to learn, work and engage and have a voice. So I guess this is the summary document of the framework, which I think is summarising. So there's 2 documents that are available on the PCP website, and I think this has been sent to people who registered, that in summary of what I've just been saying now, that to be socially included is to learn, work, engage, have a voice, and opportunities, and for us all to have these resources, opportunities and capabilities we need, societal norms, practices and structures must enable equitable access. So our work in promoting social inclusion, therefore, fosters not only at these levels, but also on fostering the environments and systems, community institutional norms, practices and structures that determine whether people have resources, opportunities and capabilities they need. So I guess it is just saying, bringing our thinking to this further level as we're familiar in our work for people who've social planning way, continuing to dig until we can sort of get to what are the kind of a determinants level, and thinking here about the determinants of whether people do have the resources, opportunities and capabilities they need. So I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment and just see if anybody has any questions or comments at this point. No? And feel free to put things in the chat as we go, and obviously we're going to be doing some breakout rooms, so there'll be further chance for conversation there. Okay, so just I imagine that this is not an unfamiliar image for people working in this area, but I guess always think it's a useful image to include, and because recognising in order to do this work that we've just been talking about, you're not going to need to be dare I say influencers, you're going to need to be influencing other people, because if we are talking about systems, practices, organisational, institutional systems and structures, this is work we have to do, kind of key tools to support it.
If you can hear me, maybe just pop your video off again while you're screen sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Better?
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
Can I make a comment about the slide, Sue?
Yes.
This is an interesting slide, and one which I've spent a lot of time talking to people about in the past. It can be very confusing when we use the word equality next to the one where everyone's being given the same boxes. I would argue,
you find it better to have equal?
I would argue that that should say equal, and that there would be another slide picture next to it where there's no fence at all. And that's when we've achieved equality.
Like that one?
Yes.
That's a good point, Bron. And I think absolutely take the point about saying that, yeah, this is equal.
Yeah.
Yep. Oops.
We're being given equal resources,
yeah.
And therefore it just reinforces inequity.
Yeah, because we are actually talking still about equality being here, everyone seeing the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Good point.
And I would just add, it's not liberation, then it's inclusion.
Okay.
If everyone can see and participate in the same way, it is inclusion.
Sure. And I think it's useful to tailor, obviously, the language to your context, and important. I just think that this is, and maybe this is an imperfect example of this this demonstration, and really useful. And if people have got better slides on this they're using, I know that there's a range of different ones. I think there is something, and absolutely take your point about the language at the bottom. I think there's something valuable in keeping it fairly simple for where you're trying to, for people for whom it's kind of their first experience with this. I think the aha moment, and maybe even you don't need the language at the, but anyway, up to you, and you're using these resources as well. So absolutely up to you about how it's best to communicate. But I do think that things like this image are really useful in helping to make the case with internally often about the resource allocation, and why just doing the same for everyone isn't fair. And it might seem like that's equal, and some people might argue therefore that that's equality. Take your point though, Bron, that I don't agree with that either. But just as something in your toolkit, because I think part of what this work is about having to then convey these commitment and build and bring people along with a commitment to equity, and showing how it can, their role. And often this is about obviously making a case for budget allocation that isn't just kind of one size fits all, that we need to put resources and tailor resources and do things differently, and maybe put more effort in some places than others. And so this, just the value in this, in continuing to help to make that case. So just going back to the relational concepts and the other work that people might be doing, and just look, I've summarised these definitions, and there are a range of different definitions for a number of these concepts. So I'm not saying this is necessarily the definitive definition by any means for each of these, and each of these concepts are explored further in the framework. If you're wanting to, in the full document, if you're wanting to refer back to those, or if this is helpful because this is what the conversation internally is about some of these other relational concepts that intersect with or are part of thinking about social inclusion. And certainly, and to the degree to which applying the framework and addressing the determinants of social inclusion, more importantly, really, will actually make a difference to each of these key issues. So Social isolation, in most of its definitions, if we address the determinants of social inclusion, we will do something about decreasing social isolation. In relation to loneliness, because it is such a subjective feeling, and that it is about people can be supported, engaged, and learn, work, engage, and have a voice, and still experience loneliness, because the nature of their social needs is individual and subjective. Addressing loneliness may well, addressing the determinants of social inclusion may well address some of the aspects of loneliness, but there's a sort of it depends. It depends on the reasons why people are experiencing at an individual level. A social capital, social relationships that have productive benefit, acknowledge the value of social networks. And this is kind of a two-way relationship, so that if we do something about addressing the determinants of social inclusion, then we will also do something about building social capital. And if we build social capital, we will do something about addressing the determinants of social inclusion. So it's a mutually beneficial kind of outcomes there, I guess, when we think about those definitions. Social cohesion, and recognising there's other definitions and approaches that people might use, but just included this in the conversation in case this is the context in which you're working. And like social capital, social cohesion is both a resource for and an outcome of social inclusion. So there's, once again, a mutual benefit. If we address the determinants of social inclusion, which is the focus of the conversation today, then we will also do something about promoting social inclusion, cohesion in the way we're talking about. And where people feel connected and feel valued by their community beyond their family and friends. In general terms, if we do something about addressing the determinants of social inclusion, we'll also do something about building community connection. And social exclusion is, is a broad concept. People define it. There's a range of different definitions, and in general terms, the key definitions tend to focus either on individuals or groups who share common characteristics and are kind of systematically excluded, or the factors in society that allow such characteristics to enable disadvantage and powerlessness. So in general terms, but with some, maybe it depends on it, that if we do address the determinants of social inclusion, then we will address social exclusion. And particularly if we focus on, as we are in the framework, the factors in our society, the institutional, community, societal norms, practices, and structures that enable characteristics of individuals or groups to, if we address the factors that enable that disadvantage and powerlessness, so break them down, then we will do something about building social inclusion and addressing social exclusion. So just covering that in a little bit more detail, because that is some of the key concepts and some of the ways that people are coming into this work. So we're going to just have a little bit of a think about a couple of case studies now. So I might just check if there's anything anybody wanted to say at this point. Thanks, Bron. That's useful to have a bit of the distinctions. Yes, because it's useful if we can recognise what we have in common, and therefore we can kind of also let it go if we think the same endpoint is going to be reached. Like, we don't need to then grapple and spend too long talking about which definition, which concept we're going to use, if we understand that the endpoint and fundamentally the equity principles that we're hoping to address are going to be addressed in the work. Okay, so I'm just going to talk. So there are some case studies in the framework, and I'm just going to talk about one of those for a start.
Sorry, Sue, I should have, and sorry if you already addressed this at the beginning and I missed it. Will you be able to share these slides for people in case anyone is interested in referring to them afterwards?
Yeah, sure. Yep, no problem. So yeah, just thinking about, there's some case studies in the document itself. I'm just going to talk through one of these at the moment, and then just also have a look at, thanks to Manningham, who thanks all up to Manningham, who came to us with this conversation starter in the first place, and thinking about the application of the framework. And we all talked and thought that their question to us at the PCP may have broader implications and interest to others, and hence the genesis of the conversation today. And so we're going to have a look at one of the case studies from the framework, and then looking at applying the thinking to an example from Manningham, and then we're going to have a wee break, and then we're going to go and have a look at some of the other examples that people have shared. So just to think about this case study from the one of the ones from that's in the framework. So this is one from Eastern Volunteers, and so what they're a kind of a peak organisation that support other organisations to build volunteers in the context of their organisations. And what people were saying was that they wanted to, organisations wanted to be more inclusive of people with disabilities in their volunteering work. And so what the approach taken was to recognise that the organisational structures and attitudes within the entities that were hoping to engage volunteers was one of the key barriers to people with disabilities having the opportunity to work in that context, so to be part of the volunteer workforce in these organisations. So what Eastern Volunteers did was to work with organisations to look at addressing these attitudes and beliefs and their structures, and provide training for the organisations themselves and their staff and HR, and developed a module, engagement learning module, for people to be thinking about, what do we need to do to create the environment that enables opportunity for people with disabilities, and recognising that it's a very broad term, but what are our attitudes? What do we need to think about ourselves in order to make sure that people do have equal opportunities, are equally welcomed, their contribution is equally valued? How do we need to rethink some of the approaches that we've had? And, you know, some of the key attitudes being addressed in this was that the major beneficiaries of such an approach are the people with disabilities, and completely flipping that around to say, actually, that the benefit is much more equally shared, and a large part of the benefit is for organisations being able to engage with a much more diverse group of volunteers, and all the things that that brings to an organisation when you have that diversity of involvement. So that was one of the case studies. So that kind of was really just an example of flipping things around. So it wasn't about providing more and more training and skill development for people who are hoping to be volunteers, but actually really thinking about what sits in our norms, practices and structures, and taking that as an approach of kind of the peak to support that change in thinking. So I'll just now go to an example from Manningham, and thanks again for sharing this. So this is part of the loneliness strategy. And can see here, I'll just scroll up a bit. So addressing loneliness in Manningham, and have developed a really comprehensive action framework. And as I've said before, already goes to addressing a number of the key things that are represented in the framework already. So noting the importance of engage and advocate and have a voice, and obviously to think about things differently and to embed that in practice of how Manningham Council goes about doing this work. So just thinking about one of the examples here. So we could apply the thinking I've been talking about now that is kind of supported by the approach in the framework. We could apply them to most of these squares, but just thinking about here in relation to sharing ways community can effectively advocate to council and others. So this is a commitment by council to saying it's important that people have a voice, so that people can effectively advocate, so that they have a voice and can use their voice in a way that makes a difference. And this notion of it's important to share ways, so to communicate with the community and provide the opportunities to talk to people about what the opportunities are that exist are to be able to effectively advocate. But I guess the next question, taking the framework approach to thinking about, well, will the ways that we share, that we communicate that people can effectively advocate, be, how do we go about that? What in our communications, if we communicate with people, in what ways do we need to communicate to make sure that everybody does have the opportunity to understand how they can effectively advocate? And it also links very closely with this one about keeping the community informed about what council is advocating for. So these concepts here about how council is communicating with the community is really important in terms of thinking about supporting people to have a voice. But then the next level down is to sort of think about what council needs to do to make sure that that is effective and is equitable. And so Manningham has done a bit more work in this area that's not detailed in this framework, but I'll just invite Janae now just to talk a little bit more about one of the approaches that has been adopted in Manningham, recognising that keeping community informed is not one size fits all approach.
Thanks,
So I'll just invite, Janae to talk from Manningham. And we didn't go around the room. I'm hoping in the breakout rooms people will meet some people they haven't, but particularly say thank you. And, I said earlier about thanks to Manningham for getting this conversation going. So to Janae and to Barb from Manningham, we've had quite a few conversations in the lead up to today, which is where we heard a little bit more about this piece of work that's happening. So do you want to just provide a little bit more detail about one of the approaches that's been adopted at Manningham about the keeping community informed?
Sure, thanks, Sue. So I guess this is just a bit of a good news story in terms of sharing one of our wins at Manningham. And my colleague Katrina has been sort of instrumental in this piece of work. So her role is around access and inclusion, working across both a disability portfolio and a multicultural communities portfolio as well. And I guess when she started at Manningham, she noticed that our comms team in particular were using some outdated language when referring to different groups within the community. And there wasn't, that equal access that Sue's been referring to this morning in terms of providing opportunities for everyone to engage and have that same opportunity to advocate. So there's been a lot of long-term work happening behind the scenes to sort of shift the narrative, I guess, in terms of looking at how do we enable that equitable access. So For example, at the moment, we're about to jump into an EOI process for 4 of our new advisory committees. So part of that process has been about, well, English isn't everyone's first language, but aside from providing information in our top community languages, there's people who, for some, Auslan is their first language. So it's about how can we provide or enable that equitable access for all members of the community to have that opportunity to apply to be part of our advisory committees. So we're looking at providing the EOI form in a number of different formats. So Auslan being one of them, Easy English, a number of different community languages as well. So that's been one of the sort of wins, I guess, that we've had lately in terms of not just doing things the way we've always done, because that's how we've always done them. And I guess looking at the benefits to the community that far outweigh any sort of additional costs that we're putting into translating resources and things like that. But all of this work that's been happening around the scenes, behind the scenes with our comms team, has also led to the development of an inclusive language guide for Manningham, which has now been rolled out across council. So whenever anyone's submitting a communications brief to our comms team, it's about applying that inclusive language guide. So making sure we're using the right language when we're referring to different groups within the community. So it's really been about changing perceptions around accessible information, and Katrina and our team has been really instrumental in that.
Can I just quickly add as well, Janae, to that, is that some of the things that we've found too along the way is that the community will obviously advise to us what language they want to hear as well. So, you know, for example, you know, now we've moved away from using cold as reference to now using multicultural groups in our community. So it's been interesting because, I mean, that's just one example, but there are a few, but the community groups keep telling us what they would like to be referred to as, and so that then does inform our inclusive language guide as well along the way. So
yep, another example of having a voice. Yeah. And I guess the other thing, of course, that sits with that in the context of looking at recruitment and participation in advisory groups is doing also the work to make sure that once people get to be on the groups and participate, that they feel welcome, that there's also work done to make sure that not only welcome, but can supported the environment enables equal participation. And so that's about particularly working with chairs. Often that will be councillors who chair advisory committees, working with obviously the key staff internally who are supporting obviously the councillors to be the chairs. So the work that has to sit behind that, because certainly there's about providing the opportunity, but also making sure that once those opportunities are available, that people are not then set up to feel like, when it doesn't feel like, oh, we just wanted to make the numbers look good, but when we actually got there, we didn't have an equal voice. And that the people who are always the contributors, you know, remain the key contributors or whatever. And I think that's the, you know, important to also put in the plan and the consideration as a parallel process, so that once you're doing good work to support greater diversity on, and, you know, a greater range of voices, which is only going to help get a better representation and change in the community on any of these committees, that, yeah, people can actually participate properly when they get there and when they're a part of it. Did anyone want to make any other comments or have any further thoughts on what we've done so far, on the work that's happening?
I wanted to say what a great framework.
Oh, thanks, Bron. Well, hopefully it's useful, you know, to help us. Really, it's and I'd say in the group that, you know, I don't know everyone in the room, but I do know, you know, people who have a role in social planning and health and wellbeing planning and equity and access. Like, it's also about helping something as a tool to help you convey to others the importance of some of these things and why we need to spend time and resources to recognise the limitations and to make a plan to overcome the limitations to being able to do this work. As Barb and Janae were saying about the work in Manningham, it's had to be a staged approach. We've had to sort of think about what it might cost, what are the benefits, make the argument, but just as a, I guess, as a tool to say, well, if we're really serious about this, then we do, here's another resource to say why we have to dig it a little bit deeper and what we can expect as a result.
The just to add to that, Sue, is that the inclusive language guide at Manningham hasn't actually been rolled out across council yet. So there's still a piece of work around training staff across our other service units to be able to adopt this framework as well and to really embed it into their practice. So there's still work to do in that space, but I think certainly you know, that the language guide, you know, is certainly something that our team is role modelling. And then we hopefully that can, you know, have a flow and effect across the organisation as well.
I've heard it's going to be wrapped up into a package with our branding guide as well. So as soon as we have any new starters at Manningham that are provided with our branding guide, and in terms of the words that we use, that inclusive language guide will be part of that. So it should be part of people's repertoire from the day that they start, which is really good to hear.
Janae,
Maureen,
it's Maureen. I'm curious whether in the guide you've developed, whether you've included universal design principles as underpinning some of this work as well, like around language and accessibility and kind of connecting the dots between how you communicate and what you're going to achieve beyond like social inclusion kind of broadly.
Not
Because I know Katrine and I know she's really interested in that, but I'm wondering whether it sits in that.
It doesn't at the moment, but the idea is that that document will be a live document that's added to as, you know, as we go through. So to at least get something out there at the moment that works through the language is sort of the first step, but the idea is that will be built upon as we progress.
And feel free to steal or borrow our accessible communication guide, which talks to written communication and formatting stuff.
Oh, great, thank you. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. So I think that's hopefully one of the benefits of sessions and conversations like these, so that we can know what else others are doing. And to your point, Monica, to sort of say and use it as, again, where we can share, you know, the internal leverage as well, like to understand how other councils have maybe made more steps along the journey than, you know, in different places things are happening differently, and how we can support that progress equally and recognise what's possible and convey that. And Fiona's noting that, you know, you have to go shortly and we will be going to the break. So hopefully, you know, thanks for listening so far, and hopefully, you know, this sort of conversation, and we don't know what the entity post PCP is going to be like, but hopefully what we've done here also has provided you with contacts of your colleagues who are doing a similar sort of thinking. So and what we're going to do next is have a bit of a brainstorm and do some work through some practice examples, so, you know, help to build everyone's sort of shared thinking and approach, and just so that's another group that like, hopefully this group's another group that you can reach out to into the future for further conversations about what might be helpful in the context of Maroondah. So, you know, that's hopefully what will be kind of a landing point. We've got a whole bunch of experts here in this group and this group's colleagues as well. So if there's no other questions at this point, let's have a stretch and take a 5-minute break. I might actually move to a different location in my house as well, just to see if that helps with some of the internet. Thankfully, it hasn't been too much of an issue so far, but it's always an anxiety, isn't it? So let's take 5 minutes. I've got 10:27. So let's be back, cameras on at 25 to 11. And stand up, have a stretch, make sure at least.
Thanks, Sue. See you in a minute, everyone.
Okay.